Good evening from Africa. It's past noon now in the east coast of the United States, so good afternoon to everyone joining us from there. And good morning to those in the west coast. For our colleagues and friends watching us from Asia, from Australia, from Europe, and everywhere in the Americas, we say greetings and thank you for being here. I am Christopher Isike, Professor of African Politics and International Relations at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, from where this webinar is being broadcast live at our Future Africa studios. I shall be moderating today's webinar to discuss the question of why African universities need to study the United States of America. But before I go into introducing the subject and our high-powered panel of speakers, let me acknowledge that we have a rich audience right here in studio. I see the Deputy Dean, Postgraduate Studies and Research Ethics in the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Innocent Pikarai. I see the Head of Department of Political Sciences, Professor Vicky Graham, who is queenly seated, and on whose behalf I welcome you all to this departmental webinar. Professor Abdi Samata, our visiting professor from the University of Minnesota in the US, is also in the audience. Thank you, Professor Samata. I also acknowledge members of staff of the Department of Political Sciences, including a good number of our 2022 class of honors students. UP continues to be UP because without you, there is no UP. So thank you very much for being here. Now to today's subject matter and our panel. Why is it important for universities in Africa to study the United States as a nation and society? Now, some of our viewers may not know this, but very many years ago in the 60s, the president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, was a brilliant political economist from the famous University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, where he studied under the renowned Walter Rodney. And the young Museveni then made a statement that is pertinent to our subject of discussion today. To paraphrase him, American social scientists do not have the monopoly of directing the study of Africa. Africans, he said, have the tools and perspectives and to study America and make comparative politics truly comparative. Although he was a lone voice in the wilderness then, he was correct. And today we have Philosopher King University leaders such as Tawana Kupe, pioneering the study of the US in African universities, and therefore giving life to the lone words of Yoweri Museveni in the 60s. In a conversation I had with the director of the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs a couple of months ago, Professor Egosa Osagai, about the need for Africa-US studies, he said, and I quote him, "Scholarship is not a one-way traffic. And the whole idea of scholarly exchanges and the kind you propose is what we need to enter American studies as respectable academics, not learners, the way the narratives have tended to position us." But now, ladies and gentlemen, beyond these words, are there compelling reasons why African universities should put resources into studying the US nation and society? Is there knowledge we can create from this pursuit which can benefit Africa's development aspirations and which can, who knows, also benefit the United States itself? Well, to help us answer our core question of why African universities should study the US, we have a rich panel of speakers, Africans, drawn from both Africa and the US. They are Professor Landry Sinye of the Thunderbird School of Global Management, Brookings Institution, and Stanford University in the United States. We have Ambassador Siddiq Abubakar Wai, Sierra Leone Ambassador to the United States, and both are joining us live from the US. Here with me in the studios, we have Ambassador Mohammed Ali Mire, the Somali Ambassador to South Africa, and we have our very own Professor Maxis Kuman, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria. We also have the privilege, ladies and gentlemen, of having a world-class university leader, our visionary Vice Chancellor of the University of Pretoria, Professor Tawana Kupe, seated in the panel today as the chief host of the webinar. Colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, let me call on the Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Innocent Pikirai, to now do the honors of welcoming our Vice Chancellor, who shall then give us his welcome address. Professor Pikirai.
From a rainy and very warm Pretoria, a good evening to you all, and thank you so much for finding the time to attend to this important webinar. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce the host, our Vice Chancellor and Principal, Professor Tawana Kupe, who will give you the background and context to this webinar. Professor Tawana Kupe has served as the Vice Chancellor and Principal since 2019. He holds a Doctor of Philosophy degree in Media Studies from the University of Oslo, Norway. In December 2019, he received an honorary doctorate from Michigan State University in the United States, and another from the University of Montpellier in France in October 2021. Professor Kupe is a notable publication record, having authored journal articles, books, and book chapters in his main discipline, media studies and journalism. He is an active member of several civil society organizations and a board member of a number of tertiary education networks, organizations, and initiatives around the world. Professor Tawana Kupe, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Greetings to everyone and to our speakers, Professor Landry Signe, my very dear friend, Ambassador Siddiq Abwapa Wai, Ambassador Mohammed Ali Mire, and my dear colleague, Professor Maxis Coman. On behalf of the University of Pretoria, I welcome you all, and once again to this important webinar to discuss the question of why African universities need to study the United States of America as a nation and as a society, and to tell you a bit about what the University of Pretoria is doing about this. I must at the outset say I'm in a bit of a state today because I'm actually having to repeat some of the things I said when at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, I pioneered the first center of this nature. In the United States today, there are over 40 institutions in universities across the country studying Africa. Their focus on Africa dates back to 1948, when the first African Studies Center was established at the Northwestern State University of Louisiana. This penetrative gaze has grown exponentially over the past 74 years. Africa, by comparison, has not even scratched the surface of studying the US, a world power with which our continent shares numerous political, military, social, economic, cultural, academic, and environmental interests. By sharing, I don't mean these are benign, and I don't mean that they are necessarily mutual. Purpose of this center actually is to question these interconnections, these linkages, these engagements, if you like, because they cannot be taken to be innocent. The result is that Africa engages from a knowledge deficit position, which poses a significant disadvantage in terms of understanding and leveraging Africa-US relations and opportunities, informing foreign policy, and having far more meaningful collaborations with the US, on which Africa comes to the table with its own agenda and urgency. This cannot continue, as whatever the US does or does not do has implications for Africa. Why so? Because current global configurations, and in particular the much touted power shift from west to east, and Africa's growing role and importance in these processes and long-term trends, necessitates the urgency and importance of the creation of African-generated knowledge and more nuanced understandings of the US as a nation and society to inform African thinking, actions, and interactions, from political relations through economic trade to relations to cultural intersections, including cultural diplomacy and interactions and engagements and connections in the scientific and technological fields, and dare I say, in the higher education spaces as well. The University of Pretoria has a large number of partners and collaborators in the United States, from the Ivy League universities to others. All of these require an intelligent interrogation and critical gaze. Increasingly, there is a need for Africans to turn a critical analytical focus on a nation and society that is a major world power and has been and is an important actor in Africa's present and future. Obtaining a critical analytical understanding of another society with this complex and complicated history is also a way of gaining a better understanding of ourselves as Africans and of developing Pan-Africanist urgency and common positions in our dealings with the external environment. In particular, an actor as important as and prominent as the United States. A friend of mine, Moletsi Mbeki, once said to me when we were traveling together on the US, when we created the other center, he said, do you know that the US was once a colony of the UK and South Africa was too? Why is it that the US is a more successful colony by some standards than South Africa is? Perhaps this center might produce an intelligent answer to that question. The current Joe Biden administration has started a policy of re-engagement with Africa. Charles Ray, in an article on the importance of the continent to the United States, provides a fairly in-depth analysis of the reasons for Africa's importance, ranging across a broad range of issue areas and subject fields, yet one is hard pushed to find a similar nuanced analysis of why the United States is important to Africa, or some might believe it is not. Even though it remains one of the top trading partners of the continent, one of the biggest investors in the continent, all of that requires interrogation as well, and a country with a huge technological and cultural impact on the continent. By impact here, I'm neither saying positive nor necessarily negative. That's one of the questions we ought to answer. In addition, American academia annually benefits from one of Africa's most underrated exports, brain power. And the African diaspora in the United States remains largely untapped by the continent in its quest for influence and agency in global politics. These are just a few of the many reasons why it is imperative to start intensively researching the US, and I'm sure our panel of speakers today will shed more light on these questions and others that I have not raised. I have by no means raised all of the questions that you could. On our part as the University of Pretoria, we will significantly be contributing to this continental imperative through the new African Center for the Study of the United States, which the University Senate passed just this morning at 7:43 a.m. I hereby use this opportunity to announce the establishment of the center. Its acronym is ACSUS UP, because as you know, there's ACSUS WITS, and it will be officially launched sometime in April this year. ACSUS UP will complement the only two existing research think tanks in Africa dedicating to studying the US. These are the American Language Center in Morocco and the African Center for the Study of the United States at Wits University in Johannesburg, ACSUS WITS. I led this creation, fundraising, and founding during my time there. My vision was always that any African university that wants to create such a center should please do so. I was pleased today, speaking to my former WITS colleagues, but colleagues in academia, that the WITS Center will be assisting a university in Tanzania to create such a center. The director of the center, Chris Isike, and I have discussed creating or talking to colleagues in Uganda and in Nigeria to create similar centers. May 1,000 flowers bloom. ACSUS UP will be the second such center in South Africa and the third in Africa, and we view ourselves as a launchpad for other similar centers, as I just mentioned, through our Pan-Africanist, trans-university, and transdisciplinary outlook. The center will serve the purpose of creating African-generated knowledge, a more nuanced understanding of the US as a nation and society, to inform African thinkings, actions, and interactions, from political relations, as I earlier said, to scientific intersections. ACSUS UP will enhance the university's global focus, growing our reach in terms of internationalization and becoming a leading actor in promoting global knowledge building across the continent. Our esteemed Department of Political Sciences, for example, is the only department in the country to offer a specialized master's program in diplomatic studies and security studies, two sub-disciplines considered to be crucial in the training of diplomatic staff and security sector specialists. Let me tell you that when we launched the WITS Center, we informed that African diplomats were being trained in the University of Southern California, partly at the Center for Public Diplomas. The colleagues we invited from USC at that center wished actually African diplomats could be trained on the African continent, and that a center like this would be a crucial a place to train those diplomats. Ultimately, we will have a master's and PhD programs dedicated to African studies of the United States as a nation and as a society. ACSUS UP will facilitate academic exchanges between staff and students of universities in South Africa, the rest of the continent with their US counterparts, with a focus on mobility of doctoral and postdoctoral fellowships. It will also set up working groups to study the possibility of running joint degrees between partner universities. Top universities around the world have similar research centers and think tanks dedicated to the interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary study of other countries or regions of importance to them. To understand a country, you need to understand its historical, social, political, economic, environmental, and cultural development. And you need to understand its people. This is how countries formulate domestic and foreign policies to further the national interests of their countries. Universities that provide this knowledge are influencers of global politics and international relations, and UP is fast joining the ranks of such globally focused universities with the establishment of ACSUS UP and other centers, such as a proposed center that we are exploring, a Center for Asian Studies in Africa, or CASA, which will also be established in the Faculty of Humanities. As has been underscored by several clarion calls, Africa needs research think tanks to inform its foreign policy engagement with the US. This is what ACSUS UP is committed to achieving, and will also be engaged in teaching and learning to produce African experts on the US. We need these experts in our embassies, foreign ministries, corporates, academic institutions, the media, and civil society to influence the formulation of domestic and foreign policies that further our national interests as states and as a continent. To this end, ACSUS UP will promote scholarly research and exchanges, policy engagement, business interactions, and cultural contact between African and American universities and epistemic communities in areas of mutual interest and benefit. It will include exchange programs for staff and students in an inter-faculty engagement and aligned to UP's major new transdisciplinary platforms, such as the Future Africa Institute and Campus, where we are gathered here today for this pre-launch, the Javet UP Art Center, Engineering 4.0, a fantastic facility for digital AI-driven smart transportation systems, Innovation Africa at UP, focused on smart, climate-resilient, digitally driven agriculture, and our new center, also a transdisciplinary center, for the Center for the Future of Work, or Work of the Future, which is trying to understand where work and digital platforms are driving the work and how we relate to it, and how we relate to it, and how it affects our humanity. These platforms foster a transdisciplinary research culture across the university community worldwide and help create a critical mass of researchers for new knowledge generation. ACSUS UP's core activities will include research in a variety of disciplines. Let me not mention all of them now, but from political science through geopolitics and strategy, water and energy, One Health, inequalities, social justice, and human rights, to mention but a few. Others include history and heritage studies, technology, infrastructure, climate change, human-animal interactions. In other words, a holistic center which allows for academics at UP, while anchored by our Department of Political Sciences and the Faculty of Humanities to find and navigate their way. Its mandate will include the publication of both academic and non-academic outputs, policy briefs, for example, the development of short training courses aimed at the diplomatic community, training of postgraduates in fields related to the US, and community engagement in the form of relationships and purposeful purposeful interactions with governments, industries, the continent, and civil society in the US, bringing universities closer to them and closer to universities. This will foster intercontinental South and North conversations about mutual challenges and innovations, and of course, also the frictions, the conflicts, and the disagreements, and response to the complex, wicked problems that Africa, the US, and all countries and continents are facing, expressed by the UN's Global Sustainable Development Goals. UP already has strong partnerships with several universities and institutions in the US, and we will tap into these as entry points to extend our relationships with other universities in the US. We're planning a trip to the US later this year for this purpose, which will include raising funds for the center, and we'll work closely with the US Embassy in Pretoria. We look greatly forward to the official launch of ACSUS UP. It's an important milestone for our university, for our country, and our continent. I thank you.
Well, there you have it. The Vice Chancellor has just made an important announcement on what the University of Pretoria is doing about the beckoning challenge for African universities to study the United States. He has announced the establishment of the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Pretoria. Congratulations to UP for this important stride, and thank you, Professor Coupe, for this. Now let's get the thoughts of our most important guests of the day, our speakers. I will start with Prof. Singye, and then Ambassador Y will follow. Prof. Singye, you now have the airspace.
Hello, and thank you very much for organizing such an extremely important event. Please allow me first to congratulate my dear friend and the outstanding leader, Professor Tawana Coupe, who is also Vice Chancellor, for his leadership. And this is not just at the University of Pretoria, but on the continent, and his global leadership in putting Africa, African university at the forefront of global conversation and on shaping the global narrative about Africa and about the world. So it's an honor to be with you today, and thank you very much, Christopher, Professor Christopher, for organizing this event under the leadership of Professor Tawana Coupe. And let me start by stating a point. The French sociologist and political theorist, Alexis de Tocqueville, released a book named Democracy in America. And I like saying it in French, de la démocratie en Amérique. So, and one extremely important point which was mentioned in that book is that by studying America, he was in fact studying France. So that's an extremely important point. So to better understand ourselves, we should study other. And I think that is why it is extremely important for African university to study America. As you know, if I just share a few statistics, in 2017, Africa had about 15 million students enrolled in university, compared to about 19.6 million for the US in terms of speaking about college students in 2019. And another critical point, why it is important for African university to study the US is, as mentioned by my colleague at Cambridge University, Professor Haja Shang, in his book, Kicking Away the Ladder, historically, the least developed nations which have emerged to become global leaders are the ones which have studied and understood how some of the most advanced economies were working, were evolving, were competitive among others, and were replicating in an adapted way the best practices which were observed. So this is another extremely important point. But where are we and where are we going? So in terms of Africa. So as I first mentioned, it is important to study the United States in order to better understand Africa, especially given the goals that the African continent has. I testify before the US Senate last year, and some key element related to the transformation that we are seeing in Africa and which were highlighted and broadly discussed with the senators include the following. So why should Africa care? And why should the US care? Africa's tremendous trade and investment potential and expanding continental integration and global partnerships represent a unique opportunity for the rest of the world, but first for African, in shaping the relation and their power globally. For example, by 2030, the combined consumer and business spending in Africa will exceed 6.7 trillion US dollar, and by 2050, this will exceed about 16 trillion dollar. So those are extremely important elements. But it's also important to own the narrative. As you know, in the late 90s, early 2000s, Africa was considered as a hopeless continent by the economists. However, we can see that in the following 2 decades, the performance of Africa exceeded expectation and even outperforming global average with about 300% of growth in trade compared to 196% for the global average. Another extremely important point, which is something that the US went through and from which Africa could learn, is the fast population growth that we have on the continent, which could be turned, and it has been done for the US, in demographic dividend. So as a matter of fact, Africa represents about 17% of the world population now, and is expected to have about 26% of the global population by 2050 and reach approximately 40% of the global population by the end of the century. How could this be turned into an opportunity for the rest of the world and for one of the most influential countries, which is the US? I think that is another question which is extremely important to refer to. And I have mentioned also the rise of global partnerships. So it is important, and when engaging with head of state, head of government, and C-level executive who show interest in investing in Africa, in contributing to Africa development, many have been surprised by the growth that we have seen in the relation between Africa and numerous partners, whether China, India, Turkey, Russia, among others, which in many ways have grown. Those relationships have grown much faster in terms of import, export, and order than the relation with traditional partner, speaking about the US, but not only the US, also Europe, among order, so that now we have more English speaker or English-speaking African students choosing China, for example, as their core destination of study over the United States or the UK. So again, understanding the United States will help building better relation with the continent. So another factor also where Africa can learn is the fast urbanization, which is combined with the fast rural population growth. By 2030, the continent will go, of course, where it has been about in 2015 from 5 cities of more than 10 million inhabitants to 12 cities of more than 5 million inhabitants. So those are extremely important. How US city has transformed or managed your transition for larger city, faster urbanization among other. An additional area, the US is leading globally in terms of information and communication technologies among other. And as we know, Africa has a monumental gap, although the gap has been reduced over the past 2 decades in terms of infrastructure development among others. So to what extent could Africa learn also from what is being done in the United States? And again, I'm not speaking here to say that everything is perfect in the United States. We have similar challenges. For example, in Alaska, we have similar challenge that we see on the continent. Whether we speak about infrastructure and the connection between main city and rural area, the questions related to water, to energy, to electricity, especially in the remote part of Alaska. So many of the challenges that we see on in Africa, many of the American states have gone through some of those, and even currently we have similar type of challenges. So that fast digitalization, technological transformation, innovation, those are also areas which are really important. And let me add the governance question here. So we know accountability, democracy, and many observers have been very critical of what we have seen in the US, where it was clearly demonstrated that democracy is never given. And I mentioned here the transition from President Trump to President Biden, where we have many were thinking that the US is a democracy where everything will have been managed in a peaceful way. But we have clearly seen that even in the US, many of the institutions ranking democracy have decreased substantially the grade that they give to the US, the ranking of the US in terms of democracy, especially for the challenge brought by the executive to the legislative body in terms of checks and balances. So there also, on one hand, African citizens overall per Afrobarometer survey are demanding democracy, accountability majoritarily, but we also have some democratic recession in numerous countries. The US teach us, therefore, that it is important to not take democracy for granted. So other reason to study the US is also to understand how to better frame, how to better shape policies or US foreign policies related to Africa, but related also to the rest of the world. As many of you know, many of the decisions which are influencing African economic political outcomes are made in Washington, D.C., whether with the White House, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, or in other institutions in New York as well with the United Nations, or in other capitals, including Paris, London, among others. I'm not saying that it is what should be done or that those processes are ideal, but however, taking into consideration the mechanism of influence, it is important to acknowledge those realities, and to be able to better shape them, to better increase their influence. Many Africans, for example, are invited to the Congress to testify on various matters. So including, for example, our head of the African CDC, Dr. John Kengasson. So to what extent African can shape US policy? To what extent the body of knowledge which could be generated can really help influence decisions which will be profitable for Africa. And that is one of the things that personally I do in my work as well, in studying both Africa, but also some of the US dimension. And I must admit that it is sometimes, let's say, to say diplomatically, I do not necessarily, many of the senators, for example, during my testimony, were probably hoping that I will follow some of the trend that they may think, that they were thinking were right, but many of my recommendations included the enhancement of the and the better effective coordination of US agencies, because, for example, Prosper Africa was created. Africans had a lot of expectations about Prosper Africa. And at the time, Prosper Africa only had a chief operating officer. And one of my recommendations was to say to the US, the US agencies should better organize themselves, increase effectiveness in how they're handling, appoint an actual head of Prosper Africa and among other, but also building on the knowledge on Africa, redefine the base for new engagement by appointing, for example, the US Special Presidential Envoy to better represent the US with high-level conversations. So I think those are some of the points that I wanted to highlight. And perhaps let me conclude with some of the benefits that Africa could also have to further study the US by acknowledging also the performance of the US. As a matter of fact, the US News Report ranking consider, of course, the US as one of the most influential countries, of course, although only ranked 6th after Canada, Japan, Germany, Switzerland, and Australia. However, many of those elements of ranking, I think, are important to share to connect with the preliminary comments of Professor Coupe. So those elements include agility, cultural influence, entrepreneurship, openness for business, power, quality of life, social purpose. So studying the US for African university represent a tremendous opportunity, not just in a specific field. And I think Professor Coupe mentioned the question of history, geography, we all have the economic question, political questions, broader humanity questions, but also enrich the understanding, help and research, learn, teach, influence, and transform the continent, and ultimately build a more productive relation between the US and Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Sinye. Thank you for that. You clearly underscored the reasons why it is important for us to study the US. We'll come back to some of the points you mentioned in your talk, but let's give Ambassador Y the airspace now so that we can then get back to the studio. Ambassador Y?
Thank you very much. I am so happy that I'm speaking to you from my beloved country, the Republic of Sierra Leone, on the ground. And I see my colleagues, the Australian Embassy and the United States joining this forum. And I know that my good friend, Professor Landry, is also joining this. I am delighted to be invited among these brilliant thought leaders, scholars, and fellow diplomats to share lessons learned from my extensive underground experience as a native African son who has lived, worked, and achieved success in America, from which I hope you can draw inspiration. Fundamentally, I must say that these experiences are built on support from many colleagues, experts, and partners in civil society, the private sector, and government, and in particular from my own distinguished president, retired Brigadier General, His Excellency, Dr. Julius Maada Bio. He has put his trust in me as his ambassador of Sierra Leone to the United States, and I have put my trust in my team to accomplish these goals for our nation. The bottom line lesson I want to tell you is that in America, I have learned the power of partnerships besides leadership to get things done. Let me expand on that with the following principles. One, trust is key. Trust in your team to carry out the mission of your office and your government. You show trust in your team by empowering them, giving them the confidence that they can get the job done. Let them be creative and not fear what you will do if they do some things their way, as long as the job is done. In this regard, I tell you, America is known for its culture of nurturing creativity, entrepreneurship, and individualistic thinking. That is why we have billionaires and experts in all fields of science, economics, physics, and the arts, because people are allowed to think out of the box. That is why America spawns the likes of the Bill Gates, the Steve Jobs, the Mark Zuckerberg. They have confidence to change the world without fear. Another lesson I learned from America is to communicate. Be clear and honest in your communication. Do not beat around the bush. That doesn't mean you cannot spend time to build friendships. But to be successful as an ambassador, I sometimes have to cut to the chase in how I talk to someone and say what I want and what I have to offer. In that communication, I learned that I must always think of what I have to offer first. What can I do for you? Instead of first asking, this is what I want from you. Third, a third lesson I learned from America is that I am the leader as the ambassador, but I am also a team player. I let my team know I care about them and they work harder for me. Most importantly, they know I appreciate them. I tell them so. This is a very, very important principle. You know the saying, no man is an island, end of quote. Yes, you cannot do it all by yourself. So surround yourself with people on top of their game, whom you can trust and with whom you can work to support you. As I always say, I stand on the shoulders of my team. Then compliment them often and fully. Tell them exactly what they do right to help you. People are not used to compliments in other countries. I also compliment them in front of others. I say, this is my policy advisor. She reviews everything sensitive I write. I trust her and I value her. This is my special envoy on economics, affairs, and trade. He takes initiative in all of our goals. and I can trust him. I can rely on him. People beam when they hear that, and they work towards being more like that, reaching their potential. I also learned to value their opinion, even if they disagree with me. I do not want only yes men and women around me. I like people who challenge me, and this is the American way. As a diplomat, I am not threatened by people who disagree with me. I want them to speak their mind. I will process it and decide. Because I have built a team around me who supports me, I can call on that team in case of an emergency. As an example, when the tanker tragedy exploded here in Freetown, my country, I was able to immediately, within 48 hours, mobilize my team who would take on the responsibility to raise some needed funds for the burn victims and to find American hospitals who could send teams for training on the ground in my country. On that occasion and others, I learned in America to act immediately and follow through. When COVID-19 hit Sierra Leone, I acted fast, calling on my team to develop the first Sierra Leone COVID task force to mobilize resources. They did, raising over $7.5 million in goods and equipment and over $50,000 in cash. Also, I will say that a lesson I learned from America and my background as a community organizer for over 30 years, an advisor to the preeminent New York City Police Department, is that I think of the good of the whole, not of myself. I am ambassador, but it is not all about me, but what I can do to support others to build the system, to help the government, to basically help the people. And this is why I humbly say my colleagues call me, and a lot of the people outside, they call me the people's ambassador. End of quote. I accept that moniker because what I have learned in America, while some people are greedy, there are those who come from the heart. Find them, support them, and they will lift you up. My final point and lesson to share from America is transparency. In the accounting of the money raised for the COVID-19 task force, and even for a major event we did for the First Lady of the Republic of Sierra Leone for her Hands Off for Girls campaign, as a fundraiser to help her Hands Off Our Girls project, for which we raised over $100,000. I led the First Lady, the Foreign Affairs Office, and everyone involved in the event team to know exactly what money is raised, from whom, and where it went. That is the American way. Trust, transparency, relationship, recognition. These are lessons for success. I yield back, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador Y, for giving us lessons that you learned. You've learned from being in the U.S. and being ambassador of Sierra Leone to the U.S. I'm sure that we'll look at those and see if we cannot interrogate them further through research and put them together as briefs that we can share amongst ourselves in the continent. Thank you. Now let's bring the discussion back to our studios here. I have two other speakers. We want to try and complete this as timeously as possible. But let's start with the ambassador of Somalia to South Africa, Ambassador Mire, to just in a few minutes share some of his thoughts on why it is important, for us to study the United States.
Thank you, Professor Chris, the program director, Professor Cooper, Vice Chancellor of University of Pretoria, my colleague from Sierra Leone, His Excellent Ambassador Y, other speakers, Professor Schumann, other, Professor Samater, Professor Victoria, and other, sorry to forget Professor Innocent Pequeno. Thank you for inviting me for this important event. I also would like to congratulate the University of Pretoria in general and Professor Cooper for his establishment and the opening of the center this morning. It is exactly a good step that will engage this discussion. To begin with, I think when I read the title of the event, Why Should African Universities Study of the United States? My first thought is, why not? From the inception, its inception in America, everybody knows America was always different, exceptionalist, different than the rest, even though it's a young nation, but still it has always proved that it's different than the other members of the international community. So in my discussion, even though that everybody knows why America is the way it is, politically it is the hegemony power in the 21st century, economically it's one of the economically powerful, but two things strike me. There are 2 points that I would like to share with you, which I think that the African universities should study. First is the American education model, which I believe that African universities, researchers, intellectuals, and academia can benefit from it. And the second is the American way of governance, which African Union can use as a model. The American education model, even though that I'm not an academic or researcher, but my experience is it has two characteristics that are totally different than the other education models. Number one is accessibility. The American education model believes that everybody deserves to be educated, and the accessibility is easy, regardless your race, your age, etc. But also the quality of education that it provides and produces is very high. Is the reflection of the feedback is how Americans dominate in every field in the world. So I do believe that if African university want to study the United States, one area that they can focus is the American education model, that they can benefit from it and bring it back to here, because that's a specific area that can produce a knowledgeable young researchers, academics, and intellectuals who will be comparable for the 21st century environment. As the previous speaker, the professor says, in 2050, Africa will be 2.5 billion individuals. As the research proved, there are only less than 700 universities in the 10 most populated of African countries, compared with America that has almost 6,000 universities and colleges. American universities are thinking now how they can invite and attract African students. Even though that we are saying that America has a lot of research centers in Africa, or American universities are different parts of the world, still American universities are discussing how they can engage Africa, but also African students and universities in particular. So the discussion that we are talking today is late, but it's still too late, is relevant. And I believe the 2050 is the year that many people are saying every 5 individuals, one will be an African in the world. That is the number that the professor was mentioning, 20%, 26% of the world population. Another number will be 2.4 billion individuals from Africa. Those people that we are talking about in 2050 have to get education that can provide them a good opportunity. Africa has its own challenges, those challenges such as for example, the COVID-19 pandemic has challenged every one of us, whether you are in America or in Africa, but still Africa was a big challenge to them. The non-state actors, such as the terrorism that Somalia is dealing is something that really we have to know. But to come back, and so those young African generations need to be prepared and to connect it to the United States, because the United States is the one who dominated the world that we're living today. So it is one example that I used to read was when I was a student. There was in the 70s, there was Asian students who studied University of Chicago, Department of Economics. It happened that they come from different nations, but their discussions was always based on the economic theories, starting from Adam till the Keynes in the 1940s. And how American capital system was set up, built, and how America dominated the investment, the trade, and economic in the world. So when they come back to their countries, it happened that they all become somehow involved in their country's economic development policies. Mostly, they become ministers. And they set up what you call today, or call yesterday, the Asian tigers. What they did was they were not afraid to learn the American way of doing things, especially in this case, the economics, and implement it practically in the situation in their countries that they translate in their own needs on the ground. And the result was that they become an Asian tigers. So there is something called the legbeleid. Legbeleid is a Dutch word. It's a legbeleid is a country X has a problem. They study it, they solve it, that problem. So you have the same problem, but you don't want to waste our time and resource. What you are doing is you just communicate with that country, study it, and ask how they solve that problem. So since we live a global world where everybody is connected to everyone, it is not bad to study others, to engage others, to talk to them, and to change. What I always figure out that here in Africa, there is a lack of curiosity. There is a lack of openness. Africans don't mostly interest other cultures, other languages, other issues that are relevant for their daily life. But the others are interested to Africa. They learn African cultures, African music, African geography. But you have a few Africans who are experts on the Europeans or Japanese or Israeli policy or America. So I think that the discussion is very interesting, is very attractive as well. And I think we have to encourage the young people, mostly the academics, the researchers, to focus the other cultures in general and be more curious. The other point that interested me while I was listening and reading this discussion was how African Union can study United States of America as a state. Think about that the United States started as 13 colonies that come together and create a plan of action that result is what we call today United States of America. In Africa, you have 54 countries, flags, presidents, currencies, policies that does not match mostly one another. So do we want as Africans to be or to imitate or to follow the way that US went through in the past? They are not old. It's just 250 plus years. And we engage them. In that year of 2050, a lot of American companies will be in Africa, especially technological, pharmaceutical, will be in Africa. Is Africa ready to benefit that technological advance of America that will come to their market? So in terms of the policy-wise, mostly a lot of Africans, they always complain or challenge the African politicians, of African policymakers, of diplomats, in terms of the challenges that we have today in Africa. But I think the right group, of the right direction, it is the universities. We have today one of the best universities of Africa, University of Pretoria, and it's the visionary leader, Professor Kube. So what is the role that African Union can play in order to learn and study in the United States, so that at the end of the day, Africa will be united, such as the way the US is today. Because the more you have a population, for example, America has, there is 10 characteristics of the successful nations. One of the population, the geographical, the currency, the hard power, the software, whatever. If Africa united, I believe, as America did, and prove it that it works, that Africa can provide and pass that examination, that they can create more population-wise, geographically, they can produce more, they can unite it, speak one voice, create one direction, one policy, implement one policy, talk as a one nation instead of 54 different leaders that have a different policies, interests, etc. In conclusion, I do believe that if we focus, when I say we, I mean the U-based center, if we focus those two areas, how to study the American education model and then bring it back into our countries, and how African Union policy toward the unity, the African Union policy, can also imitate the American ways of doing things in the past, that we can achieve something. Finally, a good reason that we should study America is the number of Africans who live in America, whether as American or as a diaspora. Many African professors, physicians, lawyers are working in America. They can't come here because the situation here are always different, mostly finance and the stability and individual freedom that they are enjoying there. My final conclusion will be, what I surprised is that American University has a lot of resources. So one question that African University who want to study in America also is facing is, how can you allocate those resources for new technologies, new research, and new centers like the one that you open? If you don't have a new facilities, whether it's internet facilities or state-of-art research facilities, your products and productivity will be limited comparison with the other, what they have in Europe, Japan, Israel, and America. So also resource, how shall we get resource as a universities? Finally, I would like to thank you for your invitation, and I'm very happy to participate. I thank you, Professor Kisa.
Very much, Ambassador. I was going to call you Professor. I understand that you are our PhD student in the Department of Political Sciences, so we are proud to have you on in the department, and you have typically shown us why we admitted you in the first place. So thank you very much, Ambassador. Right now, you're not Ambassador, you're a student, so just don't forget that. But let's wrap it up. We want to do this in an hour. It's already 1 hour. We'll try and finish in the next few minutes, but let's hear our very own Professor Maxis Kuhlman, tell us her thoughts.
Thank you very much, Professor Isike. I timed myself. I think it's 4 minutes or 4.5 minutes, because I think you said 5 minutes. So let me kick off. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone. And thank you so much for the invitation, Chris. I really appreciate it. And also thank you to Professor Coupe, who really drove this project and whose idea it actually was, and for choosing our department to host this very important center that we are soon going to celebrate in a much more formal way. I also want to express my appreciation to our panelists this evening for their insightful inputs, their encouraging remarks, encouraging us as the university that this might actually be a very good idea that we're busy with. They have, of course, already fully answered the question why African universities should study the US. I have little to add, but will make just 3 points. And each of these is related to the fact that universities are knowledge creators and knowledge producers, and very importantly, a space and place dedicated to ideas. And in terms of their convening power, universities are facilitators of the dissemination of that knowledge and of ideas. And I think for me, there already you've got the reason why you have to, but I have to fill my 5 minutes. So, I was very struck by the information contained in the concept note for this evening's seminar, and Professor Coupe also mentioned it. Those 40 or more than 40 institutions in the US studying Africa, for whatever reasons, I assume these are largely related to the broad national interests of the United States. This is sobering when compared to the fact that there are at present only 2 centers on the continent, and ours will be the 3rd, to study the US. Because as several of our speakers have already pointed out, the US is a superpower politically, economically, culturally, and it has an immense impact on every aspect of public, if not private life, on the continent, including our ocean states. Think geopolitics, climate change, military spending, research, development and new technology, trade and commerce, new trends in all these domains, but above all, the soft power to strongly influence how the rest of the world, including Africa, thinks about issues and reacts or responds. For me, the very impact of American soft power sufficient reason to study that country. This means, and there I may perhaps slightly differ from many other people, for me it means that we need to learn about the United States, not necessarily from it. Though I do not deny that there might be lessons there, even if these are very often about what not to emulate. Whether we criticize, critique, resent, or admire, follow, or collaborate, surely we as Africans need to have a very clear understanding of American state and society, of thinking, and of the intellectual context, I want to say contexts, in the plural, in that country, that drives public action and policy, also towards our continent. We increasingly promote the idea of African agency in all spheres related to our international interactions and engagement. But that agency needs to be firmly based on and embedded in an understanding of external actors, and in particular the United States, given its primacy in global affairs, both in the policy domain and in the spread of ideas. And universities are ideally positioned to do just this, to focus and direct research and networking. My final point is that such a center, situated in a university, over and above a focus on studying the US, could also become a much-needed forum that facilitates reciprocity, exchange, engagement, and interaction across our continent and between the continent and the United States. Genuine learning and understanding is embedded in communication. It runs in both directions. If the vast majority of institutions providing the possibility and opportunity of interaction, exchange, conversation, dialogue, and debate are situated in the US, it leaves little for us in the sense of determining the agenda on what is discussed and debated and collaborated on. So, a center that serves as a convening platform aimed at studying the US also empowers us. Otherwise, we are, or we remain, merely the objects of study, or at most, junior partners. After all, agenda setting is a powerful and empowering ability, and one, Professor Isike, that I truly hope the new center will exploit. Thank you, and I wish you all of the best, and I want to assure you of our support in driving this very important new center here at our university. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Schoeman, for those important words. Really very important. Ladies and gentlemen, our purpose for having this webinar this evening was not for an exchange of views and discussion between the panel and our viewers. And we had wanted this to be within the hour. And we want to keep it so, although we are about 10 minutes above time. So we will not be having a question and answer session, but just to remind you that this was to provide food for thought. And I am convinced that we have been able, you know, to get the teasers, the kind of teasers we need to inform the world about the center and to, you know, begin to form a research agenda for the center from what we heard from Professor Sinye, from Ambassador Wei, from Ambassador Mire, and now from Professor Maxi Schoeman. Before I bring this webinar to a close, I think it's useful for us to get some kind of, you know, wrap up, if you like, commentary from our Vice Chancellor, who, like Professor Schoeman said, has been a driver of the initiative, this hearkening to the clarion call, you know, to study the United States as a nation and as a society for Africa's benefit and interest. He's pioneered one at the University of the Witwatersrand, and now a second one, the third is center dedicated you know, comprehensively to studying the United States. By establishing a second one here at the University of Pretoria, the third in Africa, like I said before. Professor Kupi, we would like you to just, you know, give us your thoughts based on everything you've heard so far and what you have in mind going forward for the center, ACSUS.
It's always so difficult after such rich things have been said too. I'm poor at summarizing what other people said, but a lot of things struck me about what everybody said. There was an underlying statement in everybody, is that what we want to really is critical analysis. It's not about learning from the United States, as Prof. Schoeman well put it. It's that critical analysis, that comparative analysis, because if it was about learning from, the Americans should also learn from us, if you like, and that our common humanity demands no less than that. But of course, our common humanity demands also that in learning about each other, we might find that we have all done the wrong things and that we need to put humanity on a more sustainable basis by doing certain things. So, for example, let's take the climate crisis. We are all guilty to some extent or the other for creating the climate crisis, some more than others. Tonight is not the name for apportioning blame. But we all have a responsibility to ensure that the climate crisis does not annihilate humanity. And that is not a point scoring. So going forward, I think, is to actually identify the major research topics, the topics on which we can have convening platforms, the academic exchange you can have. It would be very interesting, for example, for those 48 centers that study Africa, to be able to have a critical conversation with the centers emerging from Africa studying the United States. And also remember that in America, they also have American studies programs where Americans study America. It would be interesting to see when Americans study America and compare it with when Africans study America, what insights are generated and what they mean for our common humanity. So I think now today, I think the whistle has been blown. So we must engage with our partners, raise funding. All these things cost money. Where I sit, money is always an issue. But of course, money is not lacking if you have good research projects, programs, and related things to actually do. And so I'm very optimistic about that. And also, I've done my part, if you like, Prof. Isike and Prof. Graham over there in the Department of Political Science. in getting through to this. But of course, I'll work with you in the journey. But this is really absolutely exciting. And to see something grow from one African university to the next. The problem in Africa is always you find one expert for one aspect and lack of critical mass and scale. And I think that we can get critical mass and scale. And by the way, let's not forget, studying America is not just studying America. It's also studying the world, because America interacts with the world. So I think that's the agenda going forward.
Thank you very much. And I think we can learn a lot and get the direction of where the African Center for the Study of the United States will be heading. The whistle, like the Vice Chancellor said, has been blown. The game begins. And I can assure you that the Vice Chancellor, like the Vice Chancellor said, the University of Pretoria has responded to the clarion call for us to study the United States. Not just to learn, like he said, but to begin to engage in critical questions through critical research to create new knowledge that will benefit us as a people in the continent, but also perhaps, like I said earlier, will also benefit the United States itself. One of the things that COVID-19 has taught us is that we are an interdependent world, and that what affects one affects the other, whether you want to be involved or not. So it is prudent, therefore, for us to start paying attention as a continent to some of these dynamics that affect us as a people, and begin to take control and ownership. The ACSUS UP, like the VC said, would give meaning to transdisciplinarity. A lot of people mouth transdisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, cross-disciplinarity, without sometimes really knowing what those things mean. We at ACSUS UP are going to give real meaning to those. We're going to give real meaning to Pan-Africanism, and we are going to do the work to ensure that we remain a launch pad to not just studying the United States in South Africa, but also extending this gesture, sharing knowledge with colleagues, universities in Africa, to ensure that we as a continent and as a people comprehensively understand the United States of America, to understand ourselves, and to have a better grasp of our inevitable engagement with this superpower. It is on this note that I would like to bring this webinar to a close. I'm sorry that we will not have a second round of discussion amongst the panelists, and we will not have any kind of exchange with our listeners, because, like I said before, the purpose of this was to be a food for thought, was to be a teaser, and to tell the world that we at University of Pretoria are hearkening to the clarion call to do this project, and we will get it done. And I'm happy that the Vice Chancellor has said that he would support this center, which he has actually driven to create. And I'm sure that because he's an honorable man, the Vice Chancellor will give the support. So colleagues, wherever you are in the world, in the US, in Africa, in Europe, in America, the Americas, as well as Asia, we say have a good evening and thank you for joining us today. Thank you.